Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Report. The mission of our show here is to empower you to build generational wealth with real estate. Today, we're going to be doing a mid 2024 self storage update. What's happening within the self storage asset class and beyond. I'm your host, Chris Berg, head of business development with Abernathy Holdings. We go out and we build Class A self storage in California, Arizona, and soon to be beyond. Join us today. He's the director of research at Yardi Matrix. You've had him on before. Does an incredible job. He's got an incredible background in self-storage, just breaking down what has been happening, what he's seeing across the country. Tyson Huebner. So Tyson, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
I'm really looking forward to this. I know you guys have put out a recent report about supply. You've got some other new data you want to share with us. So as developers, I just want to start with this supply report that you recently put out within literally the last week or two. But one of the things that really jumped out to us was the fact that you have dramatically lowered your expectations for 26, 27, and 28, and potentially even 2029. So for us, as we're going out and building, thinking, hey, if you're going to be dramatically lowering supply, we're going to be adding to that. There's going to be increased demand with all the demographics happening. Things look really, really good as a developer. So is that a fair thesis on my part, or what say you?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And the revisions to our supply forecast kind of came as we've been hearing a lot of feedback from folks in the industry that supply is slowing down a lot more than we had previously forecast. It's a little bit harder to do a longer term forecast because a lot of things can change kind of at the drop of a dime. But we have seen things like more projects become abandoned by developers. We're seeing a lot of actually listings for development sites, kind of all indicators that supply is slowing down. Developers are having a tough time getting financing, and a realization that advertised rates aren't what they were a few years ago. I do think that this can change quickly. We have seen a lot more projects kind of enter the planning stages. But at the same time, we've been able to remove projects from planning that have been there for years and probably aren't likely to get built.
Let's touch on that a little bit because you talked about the abandoned projects. So within your document here, you can see the increase in deferred properties, as well as abandoned. So I guess what's the distinction between deferred and abandoned, and what's these numbers going up?
Deferred is more so a matter of how long they've been in planning. We might not be able to get any information on a project for 3-4 years, and then we would put it into deferred. Abandoned is when we have actually confirmed with the developer or with the city that a project is dead, or something else is happening on the site. And we do check in on planned projects every 30 to 60 days. To see what the status is. And unless we get kind of a definitive no, it's not happening, we'll keep it in planning. But we have heard more developers say that a project's dead.
Yeah, kind of take me behind the scenes there. You talked about the financing, the rental rates being down. I think just get a little bit more breadth on what you see is happening with some of these abandoned projects. And I'll share with you, we're looking at a project right now. We just actually put our pencils down on it. And it looks like the entitlements are probably going to run out on this project within the next, I would say, 60 days, maybe 4 months. And they may just let them run out. They're like, look, if these entitlements run out, we're going to walk away, turn it back into just regular dirt and try to sell it from there.
Yeah, that seems to be a pretty common story nowadays. Kind of everybody jumped into self-storage. Really was happening before COVID, but obviously the run up in advertised rental rates really drew a lot of attention to self-storage. Also, projects were leasing up really quickly during COVID, but that has kind of all taken a 180 turn, and now projects aren't making as much sense. You have to underwrite a longer lease-up period and much lower rates, so the financials are a lot different than they were 2 years ago.
Yeah, plus you get higher lending rates. Some of the bank regulators are wanting more deposits. I mean, how much of that is impacting how things are being underwritten?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of a perfect storm of change a sea change, if you will, in the development world. So
I know you put some slides together, Tyson. You may jump into this. And one of the things that we're seeing is, I guess my question for you is, do you think rental rates have finally hit a bottom, or is there more room for rental rates to go down here based on what you're seeing?
It's a good question. I'll get into it with some of my slides, but rental rates have started increasing going into the kind of busy summer months. There's a bit of a lag in the data, so we don't have June yet, but April and May saw an increase in rates, which I'll get into. But really, the story here and what this slide is showing is home sales as a percent of households, which are kind of, at or near 25-year low. And a lot of markets kind of depend on home sales, especially your high migration markets depend on home sales for demand. And that's certainly having an impact on both occupancy and rents. This next slide shows REIT occupancy index to the first quarter of 2024. The gray bars here show occupancy year over year, and the blue bars show quarterly occupancy and a 4-quarter moving average. We have kind of seen occupancy starting to bottom out, which is good. The year-over-year declines in occupancy have started to kind of moderate. And we've seen kind of 4-quarter moving average occupancy start to flatten. But again, it's kind of back down to those pre-COVID levels. And I'm unsure if we'll see it kind of come back up to the rate it was during COVID. At a market level, this chart here is showing year-over-year change in occupancy in the REIT markets and their same-store pools. And a lot of the markets that are kind of seeing the most stable occupancy are more your urban markets where you kind of get less supply or less demand from home sales, more demand from people moving apartments. And interestingly, a lot of the markets at the top here, like including New York, Seattle, have seen some of the strongest apartment rent growth. At the same time, the markets that have seen kind of the biggest declines in occupancy are a lot of those Sunbelt markets that really rely on home sales for any kind of incremental demand. And also a lot of these markets that have seen the biggest declines in occupancy have also seen a lot of new supply deliver in recent years because they were the markets that showed the strongest rent growth kind of during the pandemic when people were moving in. So kind of supply and demand in self-storage never really move in tandem. Supply always kind of follows demand, and then demand now being where it is, it's really kind of it's just interacting with the wave of supply in a lot of these markets. And then looking at how that occupancy change has had an impact on rental rates. Here we're showing street rates or advertised rates versus the realized rates, which is actually like the in-place rates that they're receiving. And I should just note that this isn't really an apples to apples comparison because there's a different mix of markets in the two data sets, different mix of units. But directionally, you can see how street rates have really started to impact in-place rates, with in-place rates flattening kind of as soon as street rates started declining. Also, there's an interesting kind of phenomenon going on right now where all of the REITs are using lower street rates than private operators to kind of get tenants in the door and maintain that occupancy. And this has kind of just been getting worse and worse the past few years, and something that definitely gets brought up a lot. Digging in a bit more to that, this chart here, and sorry the labels are off, but the blue line is REIT advertised rates, and the gray line is non-REIT advertised rates in the same mix of markets. So you can see the REITs are quite a bit below the private operators on street rates. And have been playing around a lot more with street rates. They usually are kind of more seasonal. I think this has to do with kind of the revenue management models, which are very sensitive to changes in demand. But this is kind of a new leasing strategy where they're keeping street rates really low. And the reason they're able to do that is they've been really pushing ECRIs. They've been pushing them a lot stronger. ECRIs is existing customer rate increases. They've been pushing them a lot sooner. So now it's after 4 to 6 months. It used to be 9 months, used to be 12 months. Now it's after 4 months, you'll get your first rate increase. And sometimes it's pretty hefty. It's like 50 even up to 100% sometimes. And that's to get these street rates kind of up to the in-place rates. And then if you look at rate growth for the REITs versus non-REITs, they've also been dropping rates a lot quicker. This is kind of what I've been referring to as a race to the bottom. I do think things are starting to flatten out a little bit. If you look at, here's showing month over month growth in advertised rates. And I use advertised rates and street rates interchangeably. But if you look at month over month growth, the blue bars here are 2024. So far, the gray bars are kind of the last 4 years. And then the blue line is kind of the pre-COVID trend. So usually rates increase in the spring. We didn't see as much of an increase in April. April is usually the month when rates increase the fastest. We didn't see as much of a growth in April, but May was pretty kind of back to trend. And I think this is actually a pretty good sign for the industry. Things are kind of getting back to normal. I think that all of the operators, REITs and private operators, are getting more comfortable pushing rates going into the leasing season. It's also could be a nice indicator of demand. Maybe demand is kind of returning to more seasonal patterns. They're not as, I think, concerned about occupancy declines now that occupancy is kind of flattening out. So I think things are definitely getting back to normal. Another topic here is just new supply. This is our forecast, which you kind of touched on. We do see supply dropping. I actually see it. Supply kind of leveling out this year. We did see kind of a lot of starts towards the end of last year. And there's some reasons and some nuance to that. But we are seeing, like I said, seeing more abandoned projects and just hearing a lot more from developers that the financing is really challenging right now. And everybody's kind of in a wait and see pattern right now. Part of it's going to depend on demand and those street rates, which are still declining on a year over year basis. But a lot of it's also going to depend on interest rates. If you look at where the supply has been occurring, a lot of the markets that have, so we use trailing 3-year supply as a proxy for lease up supply. If you look at the markets with the most supply over the last 3 years, Philadelphia for a long time was a top performing market and also had pretty low saturation. And that's why a lot of developers went in there. But it is a lot of the Sunbelt markets that have seen a lot of new supply deliver, particularly over the last couple years as rental rates really ratcheted up. And then a lot of the markets at the bottom of the list here, some of them had big supply waves like 3, 4, 5 years ago. And now, everybody kind of got out like a sinking ship. But now a lot of these markets are actually outperforming the nation, which is a good sign that the supply is being absorbed and things are returning to normal there. And it's a good sign for some of the other markets that do have a lot of supply to work through, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Real quickly, Tyson, based off what I'm seeing here, if you can go back. So Inland Empire shows a very low lease up of existing inventory. I know that was hot for a while. Now it's not. So are you suggesting now that there's going to be less supply, that Inland Empire may come back and be a really good market?
Yeah, I think so. I think Inland Empire, because that's an interesting kind of anomaly at the bottom of this list, because it hasn't performed very well recently. I think what's happening there is a demand story. A lot of the folks that were moving out of LA and looking for cheaper housing in the Inland Empire during the pandemic, a lot of that demand has just dried up there. But I do think this bodes well for future performance there. And this is supply and lease up. So there's not a lot of supply and lease up in Inland Empire. I think that, that's always kind of been a market to watch for me. But Denver, Houston, Seattle, Nashville, all doing relatively well. I mean, everywhere, I should know everywhere street rates are declining year over year, but some places it's worse than others.
What's your assessment on the Phoenix market?
Phoenix has seen a lot of the kind of incremental demand dry up. It saw kind of supply pick up towards the kind of the end of the last supply wave. And now it's just kind of working through all of that supply. And, when I've looked at Phoenix, it seemed like a lot of the supply was concentrated in certain submarkets like North Scottsdale. And I think that's going to take a while to work through all of that. And at the same time, in Phoenix, you're not seeing nearly as much migration. It was one of the markets that had the highest migration during the pandemic. So eventually, I think that that pattern will help the supply absorb. But what I've heard in Phoenix is that a lot of the migration that happened there, a lot of those folks that moved into storage because they were relocating, they only need storage for sometimes 6 months or less. So while at the same time you've seen a lot of supply in Phoenix hit, you've also seen a lot of that migration demand kind of sucked out of the market. So it's kind of a perfect storm there. I do think the market will be able to absorb the supply. There are a lot of markets like Phoenix have pulled through. Austin is one that was struggling for a long time with new supply. Same with Houston, and has seen performance come back as that new supply is leased up.
Thank you.
Looking at supply under construction, and this is the top 30 markets. If you expanded it, it's almost all Florida markets that have seen the most new supply deliver, or most new supply kind of starts. And really a lot of that is chasing households. Again, that demand is somewhat temporary. There is obviously with population growth, there is a long-term upside to demand, but there is a lot of supply to work through in Florida, particularly Orlando and Tampa are I think going to struggle. They have struggled the last few years to grow rents because they've had so much supply deliver. And then at the other end, I think there's some great markets to pick from. Minneapolis actually was one of the worst performing markets because it had the highest amount of supply and lease up, but that's really come down, and there's just not people building in Minneapolis anymore. And actually, demographically has some of the best some of the best demographics of any market in the Midwest. Raleigh-Durham's another market that has always been one of the highest growing metro areas, and yet still doesn't have very much supply under construction. So I think that's another really interesting market for development right now. Denver at one point was kind of the most oversupplied market, and that's really turned around a lot as well. And I think, Denver's kind of an interesting market right now and one to keep your eye on. I think it was second in our recent monthly report. It had the second highest rent growth.
Wow.
And then I just wanted to hit on a couple of these slides are a little bit older. They're showing construction loans, but what we've seen, how we've seen kind of the supply pipeline change is a lot more construction loans are going to less experienced developers. So half of the loans, construction loans last year, went to a developer for their first experience first development since 2017. And that was kind of a continuation of 2022. I go to a lot of self-storage events, and I'm constantly meeting people who are new to the industry, looking to build. A lot of them got in kind of when it was hot, or they've been sitting on a piece of land for a long time. So their basis is very low. They're just paying for the construction costs. And that really has that's kind of counteracted a lot of the larger developers slowing down recently. And we still see construction activity happening all over the country. Another trend we're kind of monitoring is a lot more development in your smaller kind of tertiary, smaller, more rural areas and markets. And this is true even within metro areas. Seen a lot of building kind of on the fringe of metro areas, which really is a change from the heydays of 2017, 2018, 2019, when you were seeing developers kind of target main locations in major metros. I did a presentation at Texas Self-Storage Association event last week, and you've seen in the major markets in Texas, you've seen trailing 3-year supply come down really actually pretty quickly over the past 3 years. But in the smaller Texas markets, you've seen it actually pick up and a lot more building in those smaller markets. So that's it for the slides.
Thank you very much. So are you seeing some of the REITs starting to buy up maybe some portfolios in some of these tertiary, secondary markets as well? Because I'm hearing that they're starting to see them differently than maybe in the past.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain exceptions. I think two I can think of are like Boise and Salt Lake, which have really great demographics, great population growth. Um, but on the REIT quarterly calls, they all state that they're only interested in the top 100 MSAs, and there have been several REITs that have been selling properties in smaller tertiary markets. I've heard, Extra Space selling some of the life storage stuff. That's not in their core markets. NSA also has, as they buy portfolios, it always comes with kind of properties kind of out on their own, and they don't really have an interest to own those long term. I think they are very focused on, the top 100, even top 50 MSAs, of which, Salt Lake City's in the top 50, Boise's in the top 100. But I don't think that they're as interested, especially right now with cap rates where they are. I don't think they're really focused on buying in those smaller markets. Kind of presents an interesting opportunity for other capital groups because they don't have to compete with those big pocketbooks. But they're really sticking to kind of their core strategy, which is to focus on top markets.
We touched on the Inland Empire, but I think it's interesting that California didn't really come up much in this conversation. What's your assessment of what's happening in California right now?
Well, California has, I say, flown under the radar. It's always been kind of a steady market. Part of it's just it's so dense there that there's not a ton of supply, either new supply or existing supply, like per capita. I have seen lease up activity in LA pick up. It's one of the only markets where properties in lease up has actually increased versus 3 years ago. But it's still well under the national average in terms of like square foot in lease up as a percent of existing. And a lot of the California markets are outperforming right now for that reason. It is really expensive to build there. And, people, I think a lot of investors prefer to buy storage there because it's such a headache to develop there. So you haven't really seen supply be a concern in California. I think in California, the concern is more on the demand side because there's been some out migration. I think that's starting to come back, and I think that really benefits California markets because they have such low existing saturation.
Yeah. So you've talked about the decline in supply, some of the abandoned projects, as you look across the horizon, knowing that, hey, development can take 2 to 3 years to get done. Where do you see opportunities?
I mean, I see opportunities everywhere. Storage is a really trade area specific business. So, even when you see a market like Orlando or Tampa having a lot of supply and lease up, a lot of supply under construction, there's still sites and I think trade areas, some markets in those markets that would make sense. But I always say kind of don't follow the crowd. Don't try and zig when everybody else is zagging, and look for the markets and sub-markets where there isn't a lot of existing competition. One of the interesting things about, this race to the bottom on rental rates is a lot of the markets that are performing the best right now happen to be small markets where there's no REIT presence. And some of them have, seen an uptick in new supply. As I mentioned, supply is a lot more focused on secondary, tertiary markets, but there are a lot of overlooked markets out there, overlooked trade areas that I think make a lot of sense for development. I don't think like long-term that self-storage development is going to be, I don't think we'll ever get back to kind of the 2018, 2019 years. because long-term population growth is declining. Um, and I think we're going to see less cheap goods kind of enter the U.S., but there's always going to be new demand for self-storage. So there's always going to be new self-storage development.
Yeah, with that being said, maybe this is more of an industrial than self-storage question, but sometimes they can overlap, if you will. This big conversation right now in regards to onshoring. What's your assessment of that, and what does that mean for self-storage?
Well, I think as I said, less cheap goods from China is going to it'll kind of dampen demand a little bit. I do think there'll always be people with too much stuff. And, if whether or not the stuff's coming from China or US, it doesn't matter. Maybe one of the most interesting articles that I've read in the last really 5-6 years was one that said that, I think it was in Bloomberg, it said that the amount of stuff that you can buy with the same amount of money now versus 20 years ago, you buy 10 times as much things just because there's so much cheap goods out there. And I think that's really fueled demand for self-storage. During COVID, it was all about migration, but long-term, it's been kind of this influx of cheap goods. And, unless, there's a huge turnaround in consumer spending, I don't think that is going to not be part of the demand story.
So interesting. You touched on Florida a little bit. I'm hearing a big conversation around the cost of insurance in Florida.
Yeah.
That deterring any self-storage developers because of that, or no?
Oh, yeah, I definitely think it. I think it is. I mean, I just showed supply under construction with those two markets at the top. But if you look at supply and planning, it's a lot of Florida markets. But I think a lot of those projects probably don't make sense anymore. And they're going to sit in planning until they find a better use for the land. But I have heard of a lot of developers, even self-storage investors, kind of just avoiding Florida altogether right now. And I think that's probably a good thing to keep supply in check there.
Your assessment, because there's a lot of conversation about even people that were in Florida or recently moved to Florida now going, hey, the insurance costs or the housing's too much. Now I'm headed to South Carolina, North Carolina. Do you agree with those trends, and do you see opportunities there?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's kind of playing out in some of the data. Florida, it's hard to say if the decreases in advertised rates there is demand or supply. It's probably both. But you do see, North Carolina is doing decently. South Carolina has always kind of done decently. And I do think there's been a fair amount of people that, tried living in the Sun Belt. Maybe it got too hot for them and they moved back to wherever. But, it's interesting. New York has a ton of supply and lease up, yet is still outperforming the rest of the country. Actually, New York, in our monthly report, New York had the highest rent growth, and that's just the 5 boroughs. But New York still has a lot of supply and lease up. But I think if the apartment trends there, it has been one of the best performing apartment markets. If that's any indication, it's also like one of the highest occupied apartment markets in the country, if not the highest occupied. And I think that's an indication that demand has returned there. And I don't know if those people are coming back from Florida, but I'm sure there's a fair amount of kind of a snapback effect from the migration patterns of COVID.
Based on the data that you're seeing, and you've been in this industry for a long time, I asked about opportunities on the horizon. What are some of the greatest threats? Like, what are some of the things that maybe they don't keep you up at night, but if you look at some of the biggest threats to the self-storage industry right now, what do you see over the next 24 to 48 months?
Well, I definitely think interest rates remain a threat. I know that they're not planning on bringing them down until the end of the year. I don't know how much they will bring them down, but until that housing demand comes back, I think we're in this period of kind of lower advertised rates, higher ECRIs. But I do think once that turns around, once people get comfortable buying homes again and they see mortgage rates that are more reasonable, I think that's going to there's probably a lot of pent up demand for housing, which could flood back into self-storage demand. So I don't know if I see that as it's definitely a threat probably over the next, I'd say, year. But that's like, and also that has really impacted the transactions market. It's really tough to sell a project right now. I think if housing remains weak for longer, you could see some lease up properties that are experiencing distress. You could see some foreclosures. There, I've heard about a few, but it's really not a significant trend right now. It's not even kind of worth mentioning, but it is something to keep in mind. If you have a project that you underwrote in 2021 at kind of peak rents, and it's taking 5 years to lease up, and your rents are 30% below what you underwrote, then you'll definitely see some distress in the industry. And that could be an opportunity for some, but I do see kind of this slow lease up period and lower rates as kind of the biggest threat right now.
Well, if and when the rates go down and the housing market starts to open back up, it's going to be incredible to watch that pent up demand and what that actually translates into for the self storage industry. Tyson, I want to be respectful of your time. I mean, great content. Let's do this again, like we've talked about, quarterly,
Absolutely.
semi-annually, and just want to give you the last word. So, anything else you want to add or share, and most importantly, how can people get a hold of you?
Sure. Yeah. So I don't know if how much of your audience knows about Yardi Matrix, but we are gathering data for almost 40,000 self storage properties now, and I think now is kind of the time where having the best data and kind of using it to your advantage is really important for navigating through these difficult times. But I have been in self storage a really long time. I love the industry. I think it's one of the most interesting property types there is, and I love to talk storage with anybody that's interested. You can reach me at tyson.hubner@yardi.com. I'd be happy to share these slides with anybody that's listening in on this and just talk shop.
Great stuff. Again, Tyson.hubner@yardi.com. Tyson, thank you again for the time and the insight. We will do this again soon.
Thanks a lot, Chris.